British soldier. All around the globe you'll find him, from Gibraltar to Hong Kong. Everywhere he stands against the threatening years, staunch symbol of our common will to order.
L'impero britannico, l'impero più vasto che sia mai esistito al mondo. Il dominio britannico è durato per oltre 300 anni. L'esercito conquistava e i banchieri consolidavano il potere della sua moneta. Ma un giorno cominciò a sfaldarsi. Una dopo l'altra, le colonie dichiararono la loro indipendenza dalla Gran Bretagna e nemmeno l'impiego della forza poté invertire questa tendenza. Quando le élite britanniche videro disintegrarsi la loro ricchezza, i privilegi e l'impero, cercarono un nuovo ruolo in un mondo in via di mutamento e ne trovarono uno nella finanza. Questo film descrive la trasformazione della Gran Bretagna da potenza coloniale a moderna potenza finanziaria e come questa metamorfosi abbia modellato il mondo nel quale viviamo. Durante il periodo imperiale, la City di Londra era il maggiore centro finanziario del mondo.
The City of London was the kind of beating financial heart of the British Empire. The historians Kane and Hopkins call it the governor of the imperial engine. All these countries in the empire used to use the sterling currency, and the City of London was kind of the financier of this zone, not just inside the sterling zone, but outside the sterling zone as well.
La City di Londra seguì il declino dell'impero britannico.
One British army truck is bombed, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 12. As rioting becomes daily more widespread on Cyprus, young people of high school age take an increasing part in the violence. Here a group of girls are being dispersed after a rock-throwing battle with British military police.
Il declino dell'impero minacciò gli interessi economici britannici in tutto il pianeta. Nel 1956 l'Egitto nazionalizzò il canale di Suez.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
Gli Stati Uniti erano contrari all'invasione ed esercitarono pressioni su Gran Bretagna e Francia perché ritirassero le truppe.
There will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
La Gran Bretagna fu umiliata. La crisi di Suez sancì la fine del ruolo britannico di superpotenza mondiale.
Following the crisis, there was a run on the sterling, on the UK pound. Some people suspect that the American government was encouraging this run on the UK pound.
Quando gli investitori ritirarono i loro denari dai mercati britannici, il valore della sterlina diminuì. Per proteggere la propria valuta, la Gran Bretagna limitò i prestiti esteri concessi dalle banche.
They were not able to invest abroad, and obviously they were unhappy. And we don't know exactly the context, but it's very clear that the banks or their representative made a representation to the Bank of England, which in itself was dominated by representatives from the banking industry. It seems that they have reached an agreement which was never written, that if the banks intermediated between two non-residents in a foreign currency, in that case the dollar, then this particular intermediation, this particular deal will not be considered by the Bank of England under its own jurisdiction.
A Londra le banche dettero vita ad un mercato in dollari chiamato il mercato londinese dell'euro-dollaro. Per differenziare le attività su questo euromercato da quelle bancarie interne, le banche tenevano due contabilità distinte. La Banca d'Inghilterra, l'autorità di controllo del Regno Unito, dichiarò che i conti dell'euromercato di Londra non erano a Londra, ma che erano altrove e di conseguenza non aveva alcuna responsabilità di regolamentazione su di essi.
It's about providing a legal space in which you pretend activity is taking place. And the importance of that is that you pretend it's not taking place in the economy where it really is taking place. So you're taking activity from the place where it's regulated and taxed and pretending that it's happening elsewhere. Now where doesn't really matter, it's just elsewhere.
Quando le banche americane capirono che Londra offriva la possibilità di eludere le normative statunitensi, spostarono le proprie operazioni internazionali nella City. Circa nello stesso periodo in cui le banche americane spostavano le proprie operazioni internazionali a Londra, prendeva forma un nuovo tipo di spazio finanziario lontano da Londra, nei territori britannici d'oltremare, negli ultimi residui dell'impero.
Back in the 60s, the Cayman Islands was a complete backwater. The stories go that mosquitoes were so thick in the air, sometimes they were enough to suffocate cows. That's a legend that you hear about the Cayman Islands. I don't know how true it was, but there was nothing happening there.
Avvocati e commercialisti arrivarono da Londra alle isole Cayman e in altre dipendenze britanniche e cominciarono ad abbozzare leggi e regolamenti sul segreto finanziario. Siccome il maggior punto di forza di queste giurisdizioni era la segretezza, furono chiamate giurisdizioni segrete.
What the Cayman Islands was doing was straightforwardly illegal activity. Drugs money was coming in huge quantities, tax evasion, whatever you wanted, you could have it.
Da Londra, la Banca d'Inghilterra ne osservava gli sviluppi e, in un rapporto segreto datato 11 aprile 1969, annotò: «Dobbiamo assicurarci che la possibile proliferazione di società di trust, banche, eccetera, che nella maggior parte dei casi sono solo società di comodo dedite a gestire risorse esterne alle isole, non sfugga di mano. Naturalmente non ci sono obiezioni sul fornire servizi ai non residenti, ma dobbiamo assicurarci che non si creino opportunità di trasferimento di capitali che, dal Regno Unito, migrino al di fuori dell'area sterlina non soggetta alle nostre regole».
These small territories, the last remnants of the British Empire, which are still overseas territories today, they are still the last remnants of the British Empire. There are 14 of these overseas territories. 7 of them are bona fide tax havens, including the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands. Some of the biggest tax havens in the world today are still British.
Grazie all'eccesso di imponenti quantità di denaro offshore, l'euromercato crebbe rapidamente. Nel 1980 raggiunse i 500 miliardi di dollari. Nel 1988 4,8 trilioni di dollari. Nel 1997 quasi il 90% di tutti i prestiti internazionali venivano erogati attraverso questo mercato. L'impero britannico era affondato lasciando poche tracce di sé, ma la City di Londra si adattò e sopravvisse. La City, il quartiere finanziario di Londra, è un luogo particolare. È stata definita una città all'interno di una città, uno Stato dentro un altro Stato. È governata da un organismo chiamato Corporazione della City di Londra, una società privata con le stesse funzioni di un municipio locale, con una sua forza di polizia e tribunali privati.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little city of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London.
Ogni novembre nella City si può assistere alla parata del sindaco, la processione civica più antica del mondo.
The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
A tutt'oggi, la City di Londra è esente dal rispetto di numerose leggi che governano il resto della Gran Bretagna. Il suo sistema politico è un retaggio medioevale. L'elettorato della City non è composto dai soli residenti, ma soprattutto dalle società private che operano nella City. Il Lord Sindaco viene scelto dai rappresentanti delle corporazioni medioevali.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the court of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
La City di Londra ha un rappresentante permanente nella Camera dei Comuni, la cui funzione è di promuovere la corporazione della City di Londra e di fare pressioni sul Parlamento per conto della City.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial matters.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did,
So,
yeah.
yes.
So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
La Banca d'Inghilterra si trova nel cuore stesso della City di Londra. La Banca d'Inghilterra non è semplicemente una banca centrale, è anche l'autorità di regolamentazione finanziaria. Con la scomparsa dell'Impero, la Banca d'Inghilterra ha usato questa autorità di regolamentazione per attrarre a Londra le banche di tutto il mondo. Nel 1972 la Banca d'Inghilterra rilasciò una licenza alla Banca di Credito e Commercio Internazionale, che stabilì la propria sede centrale a Londra. In soli 10 anni, la BCCI crebbe fino a diventare la settima maggiore banca del mondo. 10 anni più tardi, la BCCI era fallita.
The Deputy Director of the CIA, Richard Kerr, said late today that the CIA did use BCCI to support CIA activities overseas.
Non solo BCCI aveva collaborato con vari servizi segreti del mondo, ma era anche coinvolta in ramificate frodi finanziarie, riciclaggio di denaro sporco e finanziamento di terroristi.
BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind.
BCCI was financing terrorism. The Bank of England knew it, says the report, but instead of supervising it properly, it tried to prevent the bank's collapse.
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process.
La Banca d'Inghilterra era stata contattata da numerose talpe interne a BCCI, ma la Banca d'Inghilterra non intervenne.
The Bank of England had plenty of time to intervene and investigate, but it did not do so because the tradition at that time, which still survives, is that, well, actually, you have to just kind of send hints and talk over lunch tables with the chaps regulating other chaps and all would be well.
Robin Lee Pemberton, governatore della Banca d'Inghilterra al tempo del collasso di BCCI, commentò così: «L'attuale sistema di supervisione ha servito bene alla collettività. Se dovessimo chiudere una banca ogni volta che si verifica un caso di frode, avremo molto meno banche di quante ne abbiamo attualmente». Londra divenne il luogo dove le banche potevano svolgere attività che non erano consentite altrove, dove i banchieri non dovevano preoccuparsi per le conseguenze delle loro azioni. Questo è uno dei motivi per cui oggi ci sono più banche a Londra che in qualsiasi altro centro finanziario.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species. And that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you, we will bring your money here, we will look after you, we're not going to put you in prison, we'll let you do what you want.
La regolamentazione morbida fu uno dei metodi per attrarre affari a Londra. Un altro fu la segretezza. Dagli anni 60 in poi, le istituzioni della City di Londra cominciarono ad aprire filiali offshore negli ex avamposti dell'Impero Britannico. Lo scopo era quello di creare centri offshore basati su una solida legislazione segreta per attrarre capitali da tutto il mondo.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated and devious mechanism. Trusts emerged, the legend has it, from the time of the Crusades, when the knights would go off and fight in foreign lands, and they would leave their assets in the care of trusted stewards.
What trusts do ultimately is they play with the concept of ownership. Ownership is not such a simple thing. So the settlor, the knight in this case, would hand over the assets to someone who these days would be called a trustee. It's often a lawyer. Legally, you are separated from those assets. They're not yours anymore. There's a barrier. You can't be taxed on them. Nobody's going to find anything about your connection to these assets.
Nelle giurisdizioni offshore britanniche non sono necessarie qualifiche per essere amministratori fiduciari. Chiunque può creare un trust e divenirne l'amministratore. Non esiste un registro dei trust. Non ci sono enti che certificano che quel trust sia stato creato.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
L'economista John Christensen è stato consulente economico presso la giurisdizione segreta di Jersey per 10 anni.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts, sitting there belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments.
Well, the Cayman Islands are among several British overseas territories who have signed a new information exchange agreement with Britain and the rest of Europe to tackle tax evasion. The countries are now required to automatically provide details of the ownership of bank accounts and how they're used. Cayman became the first signatory last week.
It's important that the Cayman Islands should be recognised as the first overseas territory to sign such an agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think this importantly reflects the constructive approach that the Cayman Islands has taken in delivering our shared objective of rooting out tax evasion.
The trust lies at the core of the British secrecy model. They don't use banking secrecy. The Swiss use banking secrecy. The British, of course, are only too willing to kill off banking secrecy because they will then capture a larger market share. That's why the Brits are doing this.
I trust sono l'elemento portante della segretezza anglosassone. e sono le basi sulla quale vengono create strutture offshore più complesse. Ogni giurisdizione segreta offre una particolare serie di servizi, dai trust alle società di comodo, a conti bancari segreti, ad amministratori fiduciari. La combinazione di questi servizi, che formano strutture complesse estese su più giurisdizioni, facilita la creazione di strutture segrete pressoché impossibili da penetrare.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets, so that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
Esistono numerose varianti di trust e strutture segrete offshore. Ci sono avvocati offshore, il cui lavoro comporta la creazione di strutture ancora più complesse e impenetrabili. Lo scopo di tali strutture è di occultare l'identità dei proprietari dei beni offshore e far sì che la ricchezza venga riciclata nei mercati globali.
Looking on the amount of money being administrated from tax havens, you see that it is a curve going like this. And all the talking we have been doing along with other wonderful people fighting against tax havens has not changed anything, It is the word where you say, go on talking, you're interesting me, and I'm going on doing what I want to do. We know everything today because we have had the Panama Papers, we have seen it, and we are not able to act upon it. And we are not able to act upon it because this system is really protecting the few people that are having benefit from it. And these are in percentage very few people, but they are powerful. And I see in the Panama committee that I'm sitting in, the only thing that could change this is to have a public accessible register of the beneficial ownership of trusts and of all kinds of companies. It is easy.
Panama Papers sono una raccolta di fughe di notizie provenienti dallo studio legale offshore Mossack Fonseca. Mossack Fonseca è il quarto tra i maggiori studi legali offshore. Gli altri 9 dei 10 maggiori studi legali offshore sono registrati nelle giurisdizioni britanniche d'oltremare. Quando altre nazioni protestarono con la Gran Bretagna sulle attività illegali svolte nei suoi paradisi fiscali, la Gran Bretagna rispose che questi paesi sono indipendenti.
I've heard time and time again from officials in Berlin and in Paris and in Washington and in other countries that they've been told by the British government that yes, they're well aware of what's going on in Jersey and they think it's very unfortunate, but they don't have the powers to intervene. Well, that's a straightforward lie. They do have the powers to intervene. They just choose not to.
Britain plays this kind of game of pretending, when it suits them, to pretend that these places are independent. At the end of the day, Britain appoints the governor, appoints lots of senior people in these places. They're responsible for foreign relations and defence, and also they can veto their legislation as well. So Britain has a massive degree of control. Basically, it is controlling these places, allowing them a little bit of political space.
Durante il periodo come consulente economico per Jersey, John Christensen si è recato spesso a Londra per colloqui con vari funzionari ministeriali.
As economic advisor, I had a lot of contact with different departments. Traditionally, UK governments have tried not to interfere in the domestic affairs of places like Jersey. So it happens in a more subtle sort of way. You kind of go and talk to someone, either at the Home Office or the Treasury, and they'd say, well, we're not actually particularly keen on this piece of legislation. It might be a good idea if you didn't go down that route. And over a cup of tea, that's quite a strong signal. That's a signal, go back to the island and say, they don't want you to do this.
Il governo britannico preferisce non interferire apertamente, ma comunica la propria volontà in conversazioni informali. Non rimane nulla di scritto, né dichiarazioni ufficiali, e questi colloqui vengono condotti a porte chiuse.
The relationship that these places have with London is very much about the British establishment and people understanding each other. I mean, anybody who is British or knows British people knows that communication between us is often very subtle, and you have to kind of know the codes when people say stuff. I mean, a lot of irony involved, and a lot of kind of codified language of the British establishment that people kind of understand how it works. And I think that is very much the case with the British relationship with the tax havens. I think there's a lot of understanding of what we can and can't do without anyone having to actually spell it out.
Tenendo nascosto il proprio potere, la Gran Bretagna può affermare che quelle giurisdizioni siano politicamente autonome.
Independence for Cayman is not on government's agenda. That's the message being sent to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Attorney Steve McPhail will be representing government at the UN meeting. The committee was set up to help colonies around the world on the road to independence. But Mr. McPhail says he'll be making it clear that Cayman is not ready for that transition.
And that message is that the Premier, his cabinet, his party has no mandate from the people of the Cayman Islands to seek independence. That is the message that I will be carrying.
Quando nel 1967 le Bahamas dichiararono l'indipendenza dalla Gran Bretagna, i banchieri offshore traslocarono alle isole Cayman e da lì continuarono i loro affari. Furono i legami con la Gran Bretagna a rassicurare i banchieri e i loro clienti che lì i denari erano al sicuro.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
In realtà, gran parte della ricchezza gestita nei paradisi fiscali della Gran Bretagna è controllata da Londra.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Gli affari vengono spesso discussi e conclusi a Londra, ma registrati poi offshore ai fini fiscali, di trasparenza e di regolamentazione.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, you know, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
Oggi il Regno Unito è il maggior fornitore di servizi finanziari al mondo.
The UK has an almost unique role in global finance. If you look at data, the kind of data that we've constructed in the Financial Secrecy Index, you can see the relative shares of each country in the global provision of financial services exports. That's financial services to non-residents. Now, there are two big centres and everything else is quite small in comparison.
I due maggiori centri sono gli Stati Uniti, con circa il 19% del mercato globale, e il Regno Unito, con le sue giurisdizioni offshore, che detiene circa il 25% del mercato globale.
And if you add to that other jurisdictions, ex-colonies, but recently independent, fairly recently, by which I mean Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe even Dubai and Bahrain, and Cyprus, then you reach a figure of nearly 40%. And I think that figure represents better the position of London in the global financial market.
The soldiers left, the administrators left, all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.
All'epoca dell'Impero Britannico, la City di Londra era il maggiore centro finanziario del mondo. A Londra vi svolgevano le proprie attività bancarie non solo le colonie britanniche, ma anche altri paesi, ed usavano la moneta dell'impero per scambi commerciali e finanziamenti. Con il declino dell'impero declinò anche la City di Londra. L'istituzione dell'Euromercato di Londra consentì alle banche della City di sfruttare la rete di contatti e competenze maturate durante l'impero, mentre la creazione delle giurisdizioni segrete permise alle banche di accedere a grandi volumi di denaro a buon mercato. Banche di livello internazionale da tutto il mondo aprirono filiali a Londra e nelle giurisdizioni offshore per trarre vantaggio da questo nuovo sistema.
This system has taken the place of the occupation, up till 62 for France, I don't know for England, but about the same time. England were physically present in India, for instance, or in other colonies. And when you look at the money flows through the tax havens, they are increasing when we withdraw from the colonies. We are still plundering developing countries as former colonial powers.
Il crimine organizzato, le società o i ricchi individui trasferirono la loro ricchezza offshore in cambio di segretezza e nessuna tassa. Quando altre nazioni del mondo cominciarono a deregolamentare e ad aprire le loro economie, questo sistema divenne ancora più facile. Oggi addirittura la metà della ricchezza globale offshore potrebbe trovarsi nascosta nelle giurisdizioni segrete britanniche. Uno dei soggetti più danneggiati è l'Africa, i cui capitali in fuga si riversano principalmente nella moderna tela di ragno britannica.
I think it's no coincidence that Britain's offshore empire emerged more or less at the same time as the collapse of the former empire. We tend to think of Africa as being a huge net debtor to the rest of the world. But that was the extent of their debts at the end of 2008, 177 billion.
Nel 2008 il debito delle nazioni subsahariane dell'Africa era di 177 miliardi di dollari. Tuttavia, tra il 1979 e il 2008, la ricchezza che le elite di questi paesi hanno portato offshore più di 5 volte il loro debito estero.
944 billion dollars. Do the maths. Far from being a net debtor, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net creditor to the rest of the world.
A causa della fuga dei capitali verso l'offshore, le nazioni africane dovettero chiedere prestiti ad alti tassi di interesse alle banche internazionali. Nel tempo, i loro debiti sono diventati così imponenti da essere impossibili da ripagare.
For a long time, a lot of developing countries, including recently Ecuador, have been trying to set up a UN tax body which is of a higher value than what is currently there, which is the UN Tax Committee. And every time this has happened, it has gotten blocked. During the financing for development process in Addis Ababa last year, I think it was the UK and the US that blocked attempts again to set up this World Tax Organization. So why would they not want to have democratic decision-making in global decisions on how tax gets collected across borders? I don't understand this. As long as we have cross-border activity that involves both criminal and legal activity, as long as we're unable to separate the two, this is going to continue to be a problem.
Le nazioni occidentali impediscono una maggiore trasparenza sui flussi finanziari internazionali e l'istituzione di modelli globali di riscossione fiscale transnazionale, mentre le classi agiate dei paesi in via di sviluppo usano centri offshore per nascondervi la loro ricchezza.
The oil from Gabon has not benefited people in Gabon. And this is true for the copper in Zambia, for the gold in Mozambique or in Mali. They have benefited the company that do extract it and their shareholders. It has benefited the corrupt elite in the country.
In developing countries, the offshore system of tax havens has facilitated the looting of these countries by their elites. It has enabled them to steal the money and keep it safe somewhere else.
Illicit financial flows, because the anonymity that drives them creates incentives for people in positions of power to be corrupt. This is why there's a group of countries where development progress is so difficult. It's that the incentives of individuals and the ability to pursue them through all the mechanisms that underpin illicit flows outweigh the type of mechanisms that lead you to a powerful, representative, effective state that can start to deliver development.
Nel mondo, i paesi in via di sviluppo perdono più di $1 trilione ogni anno in evasione fiscale e fuga di capitali. La maggior parte di questa ricchezza è diretta verso le nazioni occidentali come gli Stati Uniti e la Gran Bretagna e ne rafforza le rispettive monete, mentre quelli dei paesi in via di sviluppo rimangono deboli. Ma i flussi illeciti verso nazioni occidentali hanno avuto anche un altro effetto imprevisto. Col tempo, le economie di Stati Uniti e Gran Bretagna si sono finanziarizzate. Le origini della finanziarizzazione o deindustrializzazione vanno ricercate negli anni 60.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. President Johnson, meanwhile, let it be known that the FBI is closely watching all anti-war activity.
Negli anni 60, l'economista statunitense Michael Hudson lavorava presso la Chase Manhattan Bank come esperto della bilancia dei pagamenti.
During the 1960s, the United States balance of payments deficit was entirely a result of foreign military expenditures.
Gli alti costi della guerra in Vietnam produssero un'emorragia di dollari dagli Stati Uniti. Gli Stati Uniti tentarono di impedire che il denaro diretto in Vietnam venisse depositato in banche estere.
The government asked Chase to set up a branch in Saigon during the Vietnam War, and as you can imagine, it didn't have windows. It was sort of a fortress. It lost money, but the government went to Chase because it said, if you don't get this money that's being thrown off by the military in Vietnam, then it's going to go into French banks. It'll get to General de Gaulle, and you know what he's going to do every month. He's going to cash it in for gold. That's what the United States was trying to stop.
Ma l'operazione per fermare il deflusso di denaro non ebbe successo. Gli Stati Uniti ricorsero allora ad un cambio di strategia.
In 1967, I was given by a former State Department employee in the elevator at Chase Manhattan a memo from the State Department urging that Chase Manhattan would take the lead in helping the United States become the Switzerland of the world, meaning the flight capital. The State Department, through Chase, asked me to estimate how much money do you think is available if America were to become the new Switzerland, and how do we do it? The plan was to organize offshore banking centers in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and the hot money wouldn't come directly into Chase because that wouldn't be nice and very legal. What happened was that the Latin American criminals, other criminals, drug dealers, all sorts of organized crime, would put their money in the offshore Caribbean banks, and these offshore banks would then deposit the inflow in the head office.
Riportando dollari dalle banche offshore negli Stati Uniti, gli Stati Uniti riuscirono a fermare l'emorragia di dollari e sostenere il valore della propria moneta.
Every country looks to its foreign exchange rate. And the foreign exchange rate is not only imports and exports, it's capital movements. And if you look at the International Monetary Fund's monthly international financial statistics, you have sort of a steady balance of trade, a steady immigrants' remittances. What goes up and down are called errors and omissions. What the United Nations and the IMF call errors and omissions are flight capital. It's the reason that it's omitted is they don't like to really look at this. In the 1930s, Roy Ovid Hall, economist for the U.S. Commerce Department, wanted to include criminal movements in the balance of payment statistics. And Congress got very upset. I was told in Washington, the argument was, we're a Christian country. We don't want to report crime. It's just, don't look at it. And they forbid him to include criminal money in the balance of payments. I guess now you call it errors and omissions. You don't call it criminal inflow and outflow.
Durante gli anni 60 e 70 la Gran Bretagna si trovò ad affrontare un problema simile a quello degli Stati Uniti. La quantità di denaro che usciva dal paese diminuiva il valore della sterlina. Anche la Gran Bretagna capì che poteva sostenere il valore della propria moneta aprendo il mercato interno ai trilioni di dollari che transitavano dai suoi paradisi offshore. Ma, così come per gli Stati Uniti, ci fu un effetto collaterale imprevisto.
The British banks today, just as in the 19th century, don't put their money into British manufacturing. They put their money into real estate speculation, into financial speculation, foreign currency trade. So the financialization of London has helped deindustrialize the country because it's enabled sterling to be supported by this huge inflow of hot money, this inflow of drug dealing money and criminal money and tax evasion money all over the world that is going to London instead of going to Switzerland, Liechtenstein or the Caribbean.
Con il tacito appoggio degli Stati Uniti, i paradisi britannici offshore sono cresciuti velocemente e ben presto il sistema offshore è diventato il mercato finanziario internazionale dominante. Il funzionamento di questo mercato era conosciuto da pochi. Nel 1986 l'economista John Christensen si recò offshore per investigare. Fece domanda presso la sede di Jersey di una delle maggiori società di revisione contabile del mondo.
At Deloitte & Touche, I was working in what's called company and trust administration, straightforward offshore stuff. I went offshore specifically to work in that area because that's where you're dealing with the offshore companies, the shell companies, the offshore trusts, and you're administering them. That way I could see from working inside a big global accounting firm exactly what the clients were doing. I had complete access to all the client files. And over the course of my period of working with Deloitte & Touche, I investigated over 100 of their clients offshore, and this is what I found. There were some insider traders, some market rigging, some avoiding disclosure of conflicts of interest, illicit arms trading, illicit political campaign donations, contract kickbacks, bribery, fraudulent invoicing, trade mispricing, and at the bottom, tax evasion. Okay? This is what the clients were doing. On the basis of a sample of the clients that I looked at, not a single client was involved in what I would regard as genuinely legitimate activity. They were all involved in some kind of tax dodging or worse.
I met with Carl Levin. He used to be an American senator, and he made a lot of inquiries into private banking, asking questions to the bankers. What do you think the percentage is among your clients that are using these companies for legitimate purposes? And the answer was, I believe that 99.9% of my clients are using these companies for illicit purposes. This is a reality. This is American bankers telling what they are doing. And it's exactly the same thing with UK bankers helping their clients to have accounts in Panama or in Bermuda or in Cayman Islands.
Le giurisdizioni segrete vengono usate diffusamente per attività finanziarie opache o fraudolente, aree in cui la segretezza è non solo auspicabile, ma necessaria. Le attività finanziarie legittime non hanno bisogno della segretezza offerta dai paradisi offshore e tantomeno delle alte commissioni applicate da quegli studi legali e banche. Oggi, quasi la metà delle giurisdizioni segrete al mondo sono dipendenze britanniche. Pubblicamente queste giurisdizioni dichiarano trasparenza e che i servizi nei settori finanziari sono rivolti ad attività legittime.
Our economy is not based on secrecy. It's based on transparency. It's based on a sound regulatory environment. It's based on good governance and good government with a British government legal system. That's what our financial institutions are based on.
Well, tonight we have a response from the head of Cayman Finance after a group of U.S.-based anti-tax evasion activists announced plans to travel to Cayman to draw attention to what they feel is corporate tax evasion. Finance Chairman Mr. Richard Cole says he's encouraging the group to visit and says our financial sector has nothing to hide.
I would say if anybody wants to come to Cayman to find out what's coming, what we do here, come on down. We have no secrets here.
When I went to the Cayman Islands back in 2008, I think it was, I called the government spokesman and he said, okay, we have had an order from on high that nobody is allowed to speak to you. You are off limits.
Nel 2011 il giornalista Nicholas Shaxson pubblicò Le isole del tesoro, un libro di denuncia del sistema offshore.
The author of a series of international media reports says he would welcome a debate with Cayman Finance Chair Tony Travers. Mr. Travers recently called Nicholas Shaxson an imbecile with the understanding of an 11-year-old.
There are always going to be the politics of envy. Now, the politics of envy are exacerbated by imbeciles who don't actually understand what's going on in the Cayman Islands. I don't know what he's talking about. And furthermore, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Le isole Cayman sono il quinto maggiore centro finanziario del mondo in cui si trovano 80.000 società registrate, oltre 3/4 dei fondi speculativi mondiali e depositi per oltre 1,9 trilioni di dollari. Le isole hanno una popolazione di 60.000 persone, più o meno pari al numero di senza tetto di New York. Il mondo offshore è popolato da un curioso miscuglio di personaggi, ex studenti britannici di scuole private, membri dei servizi segreti di tutto il mondo, criminali internazionali, un assortimento di lords e ladies e banchieri per tutti i gusti. Con una posta così alta in gioco, per così tanti ricchi e potenti, non è una sorpresa che i paradisi fiscali britannici abbiano sviluppato curiosi meccanismi per evitare la divulgazione di informazioni.
For many people who work offshore and who don't like what they're doing, it's very hard indeed to dissent because they will be attacked personally with a degree of viciousness which is quite extraordinary. Most of the time the instruments of suppression are relatively sophisticated. You won't get promotion by doing this, or your family won't like it.
It's not generally, let's slam them in prison. That's far too crude. We are talking about very substantially, the establishment, the British establishment in these cases. The mechanisms are very, very subtle. Sort of ostracism is one way of doing it. These peculiar mechanisms for, if someone tries to blow the whistle, you find all sorts of methods that aren't just fire them, you give them far too much work to do, you steer them in a different direction.
Una persona che conosce bene i metodi repressivi che si attuano offshore è Stuart Sivret, ex senatore e ministro della salute di Jersey. Nel 2009 rese pubbliche le azioni criminose di un infermiere sospettato di aver ucciso dei pazienti nell'ospedale di Jersey.
It all came to a head during a states debate on Tuesday the 10th of March. Senator Stuart Sivret brought the sitting to a standstill, claiming Senator Jimmy Pershard had sworn at him and told him to go and top himself. Senator Pershard denied the claim, saying, "I absolutely refute that." But less than a week later, he was forced to admit he'd lied. Senator Pershard has now admitted that on another occasion he did tell Senator Stuart Sivray to go and do everyone a favour and slit his wrists.
I was arrested at my house one morning by 6 plainclothes police officers. There were another 2 specialist data search police officers on hand, and also another 2 police officers in full body armour of one of those battering rams they kind of use in drugs raids. So 10 police officers descended on me without a search warrant. The property was turned over from top to bottom. All of the computers were seized and searched. All kinds of private constituency data was stolen by the police.
Poco dopo aver cominciato a filmare, un agente di polizia è uscito dalla stazione, sghignazzando mentre passava davanti alla telecamera. L'agente si affrettava a testare l'antifurto della sua motocicletta, cosa che, ad intervalli, ha ripetuto per tutta la durata dell'intervista.
When it came to prosecuting me,
Stuart Sivray fu perseguito ai sensi della legge sulla protezione dei dati.
When the authorities were prosecuting me, I claimed that this was a legitimate public interest disclosure defence, and I, with an expert witness, was able to produce a set of reports that effectively destroyed the prosecution case.
Ne seguì che i magistrati disposero che la difesa di Stuart Sivray, e cioè aver divulgato notizie dell'interesse pubblico, non sarebbe più stata ammissibile, e continuarono a perseguirlo ugualmente senza una tesi difensiva. Negli ultimi 7 anni Stuart Sivray è stato riportato in tribunale più volte e 3 volte incarcerato. Non si sa né se né quando l'azione legale contro di lui finirà, e nemmeno quando finirà di nuovo dietro le sbarre.
To look at Jersey from the outside, it looks like it's got a prosecution system, it looks like it's got a court and a legislature, but none of it's real. It's a Potemkin village. None of these systems in Jersey meet the tests of being objective or actually functioning properly.
The experience that Stuart Sivray had is, he's perhaps at the blunter end of the scale. He was simply suppressed and taken to court on trumped-up charges.
Let's carry on pretending to do the interview. They might get bored. This is the kind of how oppression happens in Jersey. You see, all kinds of little things get done to harass people. Even they don't often go to the kind of extremes that they did against me in terms of actually arresting me and putting me in prison. But the authorities use all kinds of other lesser little methods to interfere with people, kind of sabotage things, obstruct people, make life difficult for people. If you annoy the establishment in Jersey, you won't get a job here. Your children won't get decent jobs. That's kind of how it works.
I went to Jersey in March 2009 with Nick Shackson. About 24 hours after we arrived in Jersey, we were there for several days. Nick said, have you noticed that we're being followed? Ever since we arrived at the airport, we've been followed. He said, don't look now, but we're being followed now. Turns out he was quite correct. We were being followed. And I found that very disturbing indeed.
A Jersey c'è un detto: se star qui non ti piace, salta su una barca e vattene. Il materiale promozionale di Jersey Finance dice: Jersey è un'estensione della City di Londra.
It's where the City of London chooses to do many of the activities which they couldn't do in London itself.
We're here just to talk about this one company called Appleby. I'll just read what they say on their website. Members of the firm, Appleby, have gone on not only to political office, but also in a number of centres, Bermuda, Jersey, the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands, to senior judicial office. So essentially, they're boasting of the fact that their staff and their partners have a real interchange between the people that are in power in these offshore financial centres.
Gli stessi avvocati e contabili che costituiscono e gestiscono i trust offshore occupano anche cariche politiche di rilievo. Nell'universo offshore britannico, molti politici sono anche uomini di affari. Sono attivi lobbisti e promotori di interessi affaristici. Propongono disegni di legge, li perfezionano e li approvano. I politici, che dovrebbero regolamentare la società, siedono nei loro consigli di amministrazione.
There is no place for dirty money in Britain. Indeed, there should be no place for dirty money anywhere. The challenge I'm laying down for every country today is to root out the rot of corruption, to ensure transparency over what your own companies are doing, require transparency for foreign companies in your country too, and work with us to spread this approach to transparency around the world.
Pubblicamente i politici britannici si impegnano a debellare la corruzione e le giurisdizioni segrete, ma nella pratica fanno l'opposto.
When I talk to politicians in Brussels, they say that they've had more lobbyists from London, and including politicians, come to them to protect the City of London's interests than they've had from every other European member state combined, which gives you some idea of the extent to which British politicians see themselves as essentially lobbyists for the City of London.
We begin with our big story. Cayman's efforts to ensure transparency in its financial services sector is being recognised by the international community. Earlier this week, the UK's Prime Minister David Cameron told Parliament that the tax haven label placed on its crown dependencies and overseas territories is unfair.
Molti politici britannici hanno vincoli personali e di affari con la City di Londra e le giurisdizioni segrete britanniche. Ian Cameron, padre dell'ex primo ministro David Cameron, era un esperto di fondi offshore ed è stato attivo nel settore di trust offshore dal 1980 in poi.
At this courthouse behind me here in St Helier, we found this. It's a document called a grant of probate, and it's attached to the English will of none other than Ian Cameron, David Cameron's father.
Say hello to Mum and Dad. Hi, Bar, how are you? Good to see you.
Ian Cameron was certainly a wealthy man. In 2009, his personal fortune was estimated by researchers for the Sunday Times Rich List at £10 million. Yet when Ian Cameron died in 2010, his estate was much smaller than might be expected, just £2.7 million.
In many cases, it's the politicians and their cronies and their families and so on, and the business people who sponsor the political parties who are using these offshore services themselves. So they've got no personal interest in closing it down. If they wanted to close it down, they could do it tomorrow. The fact of the matter is they don't want to do it because they themselves are complicit with the process.
If you come from the same kind of background, you know the right people, then all the kind of legal niceties will often fall away. You can get away with doing all sorts of things that they wouldn't just let any old person, if you came knocking on the door saying, can you set up an offshore company to do this, they'd tell you to get lost. But if you're part of the networks, you can do these kinds of things. So that's a very important part of the whole system. Upper class British public school kind of establishment that has been there since, for centuries.
Le classi dominanti britanniche sono un circolo di vecchi amici privilegiati che si sono ritagliate un lucroso ruolo nel mondo offshore dopo la caduta dell'Impero. Si sono trasformate da amministratrici dell'Impero in manipolatrici delle finanze per le elite globali e per le multinazionali. Con il sempre maggiore afflusso di denaro nei paradisi offshore, le comunità di tutto il mondo cominciarono a sentire gli effetti di quel sistema.
The reality is not what you believe, that your prime minister has the power to decide on the future of your country. The power is hidden here.
We have country after country around the world where the lack of financial transparency about taxation, about ownership, about corruption has undermined the extent to which governments deliver representative policymaking for their citizens. We have extreme cases like the hiding of tax evasion by people in finance ministries in Greece, in France, but we also have this system that in general is geared towards anonymous company ownership, the anonymous ownership of properties across London, of half of the land in Scotland. You know, do we really think there's any circumstances in which governments work better, in which markets work better, in which the distribution of income and assets is better when we allow so much to be hidden? Who wants to not know who you're doing business with? Who wants their government to have people working for it, or to be led by people whose assets are hidden, whose financial transactions are conducted anonymously offshore? You know, this is a bad direction for the world.
We need the citizens to understand what is happening, that they are the ones who is carrying the burden, and that some individuals having the power are exonerating themselves. Ordinary people are paying taxes, rich people are not. So this is inequality, and it is leading up to populism, because it shows so clearly that the people today leading the world are not able to take care of the interest of ordinary people.
Back in the 60s and 70s, you know, tax evasion or pushing back against taxation, it was kind of seen as anti-establishment. So, you know, the Rolling Stones and Phil Collins, all these people kind of going offshore, going away. It was seen as a sort of rebellious thing to do. And if you fast forward to the present day, now that is the establishment. The offshore system is the establishment.
Oggi l'offshore è il modo in cui le elite e le multinazionali conducono i propri affari. L'evasione fiscale è parte integrante degli affari.
This kind of sophisticated cheating requires a huge infrastructure. We like to talk about the pinstripe infrastructure of highly educated people who think it is their right to help others to cheat societies.
We have a new mafia in town. It does not actually shoot people, does not put bullets in their kneecaps, but its trade is just as deadly. It deprives people of opportunities to have healthcare, education, security, justice, and essentially a fulfilling life.
La spina dorsale del sistema offshore è composta da esperti contabili i quali amministrano le strutture che permettono poi ad individui o società di trasferire denaro offshore ed evadere le tasse.
There are about 2.5 million professionally qualified accountants on this planet. About 330,000 are in the UK.
Well-known people, well-dressed, well-fed, highly paid, are sitting in city centre offices, and they are paid to dream up tax avoidance schemes for individuals and for corporations.
We can all elect a government which says, vote for us, we will give you better healthcare, better education, better security. And next day accountants say, sorry about that, folks, you elected this government, but we actually got a tax avoidance scheme, and the Amazons and the Googles and Microsofts won't be paying any taxes in your jurisdiction. Too bad. You voted for it, but actually you're going to get something else.
So it's a crazy world that part of the business model at big accountancy firms is how to deny public the services by erosion of tax revenues. And these firms are then rewarded with government-funded contracts, and the same firms are then advising local governments and the central governments, and the same firms then report on the company accounts and tell us all is well.
When I argue this with a Pricewaterhouse partner in a face-to-face debate, he said, Professor Sicker, you never give us credit for anything. We generate millions of dollars of revenues, and we have lots and lots of satisfied clients. What is your problem? And my response was very simple: that's the language of drug pushers and pimps.
Un nuovo genere di funzionari pubblici stava facendo carriera. Uno di questi fu David Hartnett, che salì fino al vertice di HMRC, l'autorità fiscale del Regno Unito. David Hartnett escogitò un nuovo modo per riscuotere le tasse. Gli accordi sarebbero stati negoziati su base individuale e a porte chiuse. Nel caso di soggetti importanti, queste negoziazioni venivano condotte da David Hartnett in persona. British Telecom fu una delle prime compagnie a sperimentare il nuovo schema e ricevette un rimborso fiscale per oltre 1 miliardo di sterline. Ben Verweyden, amministratore delegato di British Telecom, scrisse: «L'utile per azione è salito del 14% e, bene a sapersi, abbiamo avuto un credito d'imposta dal fisco di 1 miliardo di sterline». Secondo David Hartnett, questo approccio era più efficace.
Litigation in the courts is really phenomenally expensive in this day and age all over the world, and I think is to be avoided where possible. And the art is to persuade people to pay by strength of argument and the like.
Dopo le proteste esplose del 2011, la Commissione ristretta del Tesoro interrogò Dave Hartnett, il quale dichiarò di non poter dare nessuna informazione per motivi di riservatezza.
What in statute prevents you from disclosing information to Parliament?
All my advice, Mr. Barclay, so far has been that I am prevented, and my colleagues are prevented, by the Act and by the decision of the Commissioners.
Dave Hartnett evitò di menzionare che, stando ai consigli legali ricevuti, la divulgazione di informazioni era demandata alla discrezione del responsabile di HMRC. Il responsabile di HMRC era David Hartnett stesso.
Just like the mafia has penetrated the state, accountancy firms have also penetrated the state. At the head of anti-avoidance in the UK, tax authority is from one of these firms. The newly appointed chairman of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is a tax authority, is a partner from KPMG. Their partners have penetrated the state. They are running the treasury.
L'industria dei servizi finanziari ha penetrato lo Stato e cominciato a strutturarne le leggi per i propri scopi.
The degree of political capture by the City of London, by the big banks and the big law firms is so enormous that the politicians have effectively become their spokespersons.
Con il governo restio ad agire nell'interesse pubblico, un gruppo di attivisti affrontarono Dave Hartnett ad un evento privato ad Oxford.
Hi everybody, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to take a few moments of your time. Here tonight to present Dave with an award. It is the Lifetime Achievement Award for services to corporate tax planning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dave's been a great friend to the industry, a great friend to many of us over the years, and really we just can't thank him enough for what he's done.
Obviously us at Vodafone, it saved us billions off our tax bill, and our friends at Goldman Sachs as well, we've also saved us millions as well.
25 million or so.
These people are trespassers and intruders.
And I know you've had problems with
this is an unlawful conspiracy to trespass. And you will go, sir. You will depart immediately before we set the dogs on you. Go. You're trespassing. Okay.
Sorry.
You are trespassing, scum. Go.
Dopo aver lasciato HMRC, Dave Hartnett entrò nel settore privato per ricoprire una carica nella società di revisione contabile Deloitte, dove presta consulenze sulla tassazione societaria a governi esteri. Dave Hartnett è membro dell'Ordine del Bagno, un onore elargitogli dalla monarca britannica.
We have former ministers acting as advisors to accountancy firms. Accountancy firms provide jobs and consultancies for potential ministers. To my mind, really, it's an indication of corrupt structures. People are buying and selling influences. When a former minister works for an accountancy firm, he's not providing any accounting knowledge, he's opening political opportunities, home and abroad. That is what they are doing.
I hope by now you'll share my view that I don't trust most bankers, I don't trust most lawyers, I don't trust most accounting firms. I actually think they're engaged in a conspiracy against public interest.
In Gran Bretagna, segretezza e complessità di finanza e governo facilitano il mascheramento della corruzione nelle cariche pubbliche. Le strutture finanziarie sono spesso così complesse che anche dopo essere state rese pubbliche non vengono generalmente capite per ciò che sono. PFI, iniziativa finanziaria privata, ne è un esempio.
PFI is Private Finance Initiative. It is a way of funding public infrastructure, things like hospitals, schools, roads and bridges, but financing them via the private sector rather than the historical method, which is via central government. Over a period of 30 or 40 years, the amount of kind of repayment costs will be sort of 3 or 4 times higher overall than if you'd borrowed it from central government in the first place. So it's basically a giant accounting scam. Once the PFI policy has been set up, you find that the big 4 accountancy firms were actually paid members of staff within the Treasury Department who were then actually going around and selling and advising upon the implementation of PFI contracts by public authorities.
Effectively saying, come to us and we will show you how to derive the most benefit from it. In other words, how to perhaps exploit the legislation.
Even the offices of the state tax authority are now owned offshore. HMRC, which is the tax collector here in the UK, their offices are owned in Bermuda by a company called Mapley Steps. It's quite incredible.
La società proprietaria del contratto PFI, che gestisce la sede principale di HMRC, ha preso denaro in prestito da investitori offshore ad un interesse del 15%. Siccome gli interessi erano così alti, la società era in passivo e di conseguenza non pagava tasse. Nel 2011 HMRC dovette ammettere che nessuna delle controllate da PFI stesse pagando tasse nel Regno Unito.
I think we need to have a serious conversation about the role of government in this whole debacle and how much our government has been penetrated by big banks and accountancy firms and ultimately in whose interest it operates. The reason we were protesting outside the Africa PPP conference is that we wanted to make sure that citizens back in Africa should hear about the fact that such policies have been a complete failure here in the UK. We know that these products are not being marketed to African countries in their own best interests. The only motivation is to spread the reach of financial services into new markets. It's all being promoted in the interest of the City of London. What you're seeing is basically a second form of colonialisation. You've had initially occupation, resource extraction, and through that process, countries like Britain, which have had a large offshore empire, have developed significant networks, and now those networks are being used to promote and exploit financial services.
La City di Londra era il cuore pulsante finanziario dell'Impero britannico. Con il declino di quell'impero, la City si trasformò da fulcro operativo della macchina finanziaria dell'impero a centro finanziario globale. Quelle che una volta erano le insignificanti frange dell'impero sono ora le basi sulle quali è tessuta la tela delle giurisdizioni segrete offshore, che attraggono ricchezze da ogni angolo del globo per veicolarle verso la City di Londra. Oggi il 25% della finanza internazionale viene condotta in territori britannici. Quasi la metà delle giurisdizioni segrete del mondo sono sotto il controllo britannico. Fino a metà della ricchezza offshore potrebbe trovarsi nascosta nei paradisi fiscali britannici. Le élite britanniche si arricchiscono con i servizi finanziari, la stessa fonte da cui ex ministri, alti funzionari pubblici e persino le spie in pensione di MI5 e MI6 si guadagnano ricche consulenze dopo una carriera spesa nel pubblico. Tutti questi soggetti hanno trasformato la Gran Bretagna e le sue dipendenze nel più grande paradiso fiscale del pianeta, compromettendo lo sviluppo in tutto il mondo e facendo diventare la stessa Gran Bretagna una nazione al servizio soprattutto degli interessi delle sue élite.